everybody, welcome to Learn with Steph. This is one of the videos as part of our Lessons in Law series. The focus is on OCR A Level Law, but it will be useful to anybody studying law. If you like the videos, please do subscribe and press the like button at the bottom. This is the third lesson within the legislative process part of the course. So we're looking at the OCR A Level Law course. In the first lesson, we covered the pre-parliamentary stages of legislation, so the green and white papers and different types of bills. In the second lesson, we focused on how a bill becomes a law through going through Parliament, so the parliamentary legislative process. And this lesson, we are focusing on evaluation. So we're going to explore how you evaluate the legislative process. For OCR A Level Law, we're looking today at the Section A, Papers 1 and 2 evaluation questions. So for OCR, you will remember that these questions are worth 15 marks. You will have to answer one of them in paper 1 and one of them in paper 2, and you only get awarded for assessment objective 3. And I would advise you to structure your paragraphs in the same way. So start with making a developed point. And that developed point will use the question that you have been given. So if the question is asking you to evaluate juries, you will say perhaps one problem with juries is, but we're of course looking at parliamentary lawmaking process, aren't we? So we might say one advantage of the parliamentary lawmaking process is time, let's say. And then our evaluation marks actually start with that word because, don't they? So one advantage of the parliamentary lawmaking process is time because, and then you would make your evaluation point. Now, even though you're marked only on assessment objective 3, so evaluation, obviously your evaluation points will often mention specific details about the law. Okay, your next sentence is going to be a developed reason. So you're going to build on that developed point that you made in your first sentence. This is an advantage or a disadvantage because. And then that would be followed by a developed example. For example, and you might mention a statute or a case or another example which you would explain how it illustrates your advantage or your disadvantage. And then you could build on those 3 essential sentences by making a further developed comment using the word furthermore. For OCR A Level, I would suggest that you do 4 very clear paragraphs for a 15-mark question. You don't need an introduction, you don't need a conclusion, but you do need 4 developed evaluative paragraphs. And just to make sure you are fully developing your paragraphs, my advice is to do 2 of those 4 paragraphs with the additional further development sentence. So your your whole essay will be 4 paragraphs, 2 paragraphs of 4 sentences, and 2 paragraphs of 3 sentences. And you would be expected to write that answer in 15 minutes. That's a mark a minute. This lesson is, of course, focusing on evaluating the parliamentary legislative process, so how a bill becomes law. You need to think of at least, or you need to know at least 4 advantages of parliamentary lawmaking and 4 disadvantages of parliamentary lawmaking. So you can write a 4-paragraph essay for either, or a 4-paragraph essay about both. Look at the pictures. Can you use any of those as a stimulus to think of evaluative points to make? So think about how long a bill might take to go through all those parliamentary stages that we learnt about in lesson 2. Is it a good thing that it has to pass through all those stages? Or is it a bad thing? Or could you see it as good and bad in some ways? The scales, checks and balances. How does the process create checks and balances? Is that a positive or a negative? Look at the way the P's are laid out really precisely. Precision. How precise are Acts of Parliament? How does the process ensure that precision? Then we've got a picture of the House of Lords. What did we learn about the House of Lords in lesson 1 and 2 of legislation? Can you use that information to make an evaluative point? So I would suggest, for advantages, your 4 key paragraphs will be that it's a democratic lawmaking process, that it's precise, there's lots of detail. The process requires consultation, allows for consultation, and there are lots of checks and balances. If these are your 4 key points, think about how you could explain each of them. What law knowledge would you use? Why is it an advantage? Why is the attention to detail that the process that a bill has to go through in order to become law? Why is that an advantage? Can you provide an example that illustrates the point that we're going to make? So let's look at one paragraph that you could write for this essay. So beginning with a developed point. Using the writing frame that we looked at the beginning of the lesson. One advantage of the parliamentary lawmaking process. So you should be able to tell from your very first sentence of every paragraph what the question being asked is. And that is a rule for any essay in law. One advantage of the parliamentary lawmaking process is that it's democratic, because, there's your evaluative word, the House of Commons is an elected body answerable to the electorate every 5 years. And you might be thinking that that's AO1, that's knowledge. And yes, it is knowledge, but it's very difficult to evaluate something without showing knowledge. So the evaluative point is it's democratic, and you need to explain how the parliamentary process is democratic. And it's democratic because the House of Commons is elected every 5 years by the public. Your developed point, so your first sentence, will then be followed by a developed reason. And your writing frame is, this is an advantage because. Or obviously, if the question is about disadvantages, this is a disadvantage because. So for this paragraph, it would be, this is an advantage because the lawmakers are accountable and must follow the public's wishes. Can you think of an example that you could use of a law that shows the advantage of it being a democratic process? So think of how Parliament has fulfilled the public's wishes through passing a law. What example would you use? A developed example, then you could begin with, for example. And I've used this example, but you could just as easily use Brexit as an example too. For example, the Parliamentary Acts were used to force through the hunting bill, and I haven't put the date, all right, 2004, but I haven't put it down, all right, it doesn't matter. So for example, the Parliamentary Acts were used to force through the hunting bill, which was a manifesto promise strongly supported by the general public. You could also write, for example, the European Referendum Act was passed, which was a manifesto promise strongly supported by the general public through an election. Okay. And then for two of your paragraphs, I have suggested you have a furthermore point. So furthermore, if the public do not like a law that has been passed, laws can be changed because one parliament cannot bind another. And you might not know that, but there's a rule that statutes can't be entrenched. So a statute can always be repealed by another parliament if they don't like it. Okay, so looking at other developed points you could make. So we've talked about attention to detail. Why, in what way is the process detailed? Because it offers opportunities for scrutiny, it offers opportunities for debate. It makes the acts really detailed. In fact, unlike several other countries in the world, the UK statutes often cover lots and lots of contingencies, lots of scenarios. UK legislation is really detailed compared to, for instance, a lot of European countries. And an example of this would be how the bill has to pass through lots and lots of stages. You could mention the committee stage here. You could mention the fact that it goes to the other house to be scrutinised. You could even mention a specific act that you know well that has lots of detailed recommendations. So I've used here the Coronavirus Act because it's been on the news. So I've used the details. The Coronavirus Act 2020 included details such as recruitment to the NHS and retention of DNA time extensions by the police. Another paragraph you could talk about is consultation, because lots and lots of the stages of parliamentary lawmaking allows for public consultation. Why is that an advantage? Well, clearly because it means that lots of people can give their views. There's lots of input. It allows for experts to contribute. It allows for interested parties to contribute. It means, of course, that a statute will have the support of the interested parties, or in theory. And again, your example, think about an Education Act. Who might be consulted? Unions might be consulted. You would hope businesses, universities, all might be consulted whenever an Education Act is tabled in Parliament. And then another advantage is, of course, the House of Lords. Because, as I said in the first lesson, the House of Lords is made up of many, many experts who will provide that expertise, that detailed scrutiny, that detailed examination, that consultation. Do you remember I mentioned that Sir Alan Sugar was in the House of Lords? Well, imagine how much expertise Alan Sugar has in the field of business. And of course, the House of Lords acts as a safety net within the parliamentary lawmaking process, because the House of Lords holds the House of Commons to account. It will challenge it, it will ask questions, and it will often find errors that the House of Commons has missed. So it's like, if you want, a second proofreading. If you're applying for a job, you might fill in an application form and then ask your parents to look over that form and check it for errors. If a bill is introduced in the House of Commons, the House of Lords will read that bill and will check it for errors, might add to it, improve it. So that's got to be a good thing. And your example, you could use Alan Sugar. You could just talk about scientists being in the House of Lords. And again, you can link that to the Coronavirus Act. Andrew Lloyd Webber, of course, is in the House of Lords. And of course, he is an expert on the entertainment industry. So any of those sorts of examples will do. If you can't remember the name of someone, then keep it general. Scientists, sports people, that's fine. Turning to disadvantages, you'll see that 3 of the points are flip points to the advantages. So we've talked about how time could be seen as an advantage. We've talked about how detail could be an advantage, and how the House of Lords could be seen as an advantage. Well, here I'm saying there are also disadvantages, alongside some of the stages not actually moving a bill forward and being a waste of parliamentary time. Think about how you could switch these advantages to disadvantages. So, time. As you know, the parliamentary process of lawmaking is 5 stages. So we have the pre-parliamentary process, green paper, white paper, draft bill. And then we have the 5 stages of the parliamentary lawmaking process. First reading, second reading, report stage, committee stage, third reading. And then it goes to the other house to go through the 5 stages yet again. So in the other house, it will go through a first reading, a second reading, a report stage, a committee stage, a report stage, and a third reading. And then it has the royal assent. So that's a long process. And you can imagine some bills simply run out of time because it all has to be completed in one parliamentary year. A good example of a bill that ran out of time was the bill put forward a few years ago to lower the voting age to 16 years. You might well be aware that this is often put forward as a as a really big argument to involve younger people in the democratic process. Well, this has been tabled in Parliament, but it was never passed, partly because it didn't have support of enough MPs, but partly and mainly because the bill simply ran out of time to go through all those stages. The bills, as I've said, laws in the UK, as I've already said, are very detailed. And some people might claim they're too complex because they try to cover every possible scenario. Now, yes, we've said that could be a good thing, but the problem can be they are over complex sometimes, and that leads to them being inaccessible to the general public. If you actually look at how a piece of legislation is written, sometimes it's quite difficult to understand it, and that in turn can lead to the courts having to interpret what a piece of legislation means. And in a later lesson, we'll look at statutory interpretation. And your example can be any case really that you study that interprets a statute. So think about perhaps from your criminal law study, a case that has had to interpret something that is not clear in a piece of legislation. The classic example used by most candidates is the Dangerous Dogs Act of 1991. That has required lots and lots of statutory interpretation. So it's required courts on several occasions to try to interpret and make that piece of legislation clear. Another disadvantage then could be that some of the stages really are seen as a waste of parliamentary time. For instance, that first stage where they just simply read out the name of the bill and perhaps its broad aims and then just set a date for the second reading. Does that really need to happen in Parliament? In fact, a legal scholar called Professor Zander, great name, isn't it? Professor Zander called this particular part of the parliamentary process as a pure moment of nothing. And I think that quote is worth remembering, a pure moment of nothing. And finally, another disadvantage is the House of Lords. Yes, I know I said earlier in the lesson that the House of Lords is an advantage because it provides expertise and checks and balances. But remember, it is made up of unelected people. So the argument is the House of Lords is undemocratic. We don't vote for them. And if it's undemocratic, the argument is that it doesn't represent the public's view and it's not accountable to us. If we don't like what the House of Lords are saying, we cannot vote them out. However, we can vote out our members of Parliament in the House of Commons in a general election. So the House of Lords could be seen as a disadvantage in the legislative process because it's made up of unelected peers. An example, well, really great example is the Hunting Act. And I know we've used it again before, but that's absolutely fine. So the Hunting Act of 2004, the House of Lords tried to block that act. Now that was a manifesto promise made by the Labour Party led by Tony Blair at the time, and they were voted in actually by a landslide victory for Labour, and that was one of their key manifesto promises. Yet the House of Lords tried to prevent that bill from becoming law. Remember that the House of Commons had to use the Parliamentary Act in order to force the piece of legislation through. So that's a really good example of the House of Lords not representing the public's wishes. It is well worth you trying an essay. So remember, these are 15-mark essays, and it should take you 15 minutes. And it's really easy to do this essay if you use the writing frame that I have taught you. So you're using one advantage, disadvantage, benefit, whatever the question is in that opening sentence, because this is a benefit, advantage, whatever, because, for example, and then furthermore. And you're going to do that, certainly the core 3 sentences, you're going to do that 4 times in that 15 minutes. So try the question. Discuss the advantages and disadvantages of the parliamentary lawmaking process. You need to make 2 developed points with developed examples of disadvantages and 2 of advantages. Try to time yourself and use that writing frame. You must have developed points in order to get to the top band in these 15 marks essays. So that's brought us to the end of these 3 lessons on the legislative process. In lesson 1, we went through green and white papers and different types of bill. Make sure you check your learning, make sure you know what different types of bill there are, and embed that knowledge. Lesson 2, we went through the parliamentary lawmaking process. Go back over that mantra. Green-winged dragons is the pre-parliamentary stages. Green-winged dragons, green paper, white paper, draft bill. Parliamentary stages. Fly slowly, clockwise, round the old ruin. Fly first reading, slowly second reading. Clockwise, committee stage, round, report stage. The third reading. Old, other house, goes through the same 5 stages. Ruin, royal assent. You need to know that process. And then in this lesson, we've evaluated that process, and you should know 4 positive evaluative points with examples and 4 negatives with examples. Go back over the 3 lessons, your notes, check your learning, check your understanding, and embed it. That brings us to the end of this lesson in law. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please like it and subscribe to find more videos. Bye.